Welcome back to my brief introduction to Python programming. If you're with me for the third tutorial, repetition, then I can try to redeem myself for my past spelling error on repetition where I had an I here instead of an E. I could blame my secretary, but I'm not quite sure people have secretaries anymore. Not with email. I think we all do the work ourselves. So I'll blame spell check instead, because it's certainly not me. But anyways, repetition. So let's have a look at repetition. We'll look at sequence selection. Now we're going to do something several times. So let's kill this code, and I'm going to speed up a little bit by using the old case of here's the one I made earlier. I'm going to copy and paste this code in here and explain it and then run it. Oh no, that's selection. Here's my repetition. And I have repetition. This is a while loop. So what I want to do now is I'm going to create a variable. I'll place the whole data temporarily with a name, and the name is going to be response. And then I'm going to assign, using the assignment operator, the value that the user types in. I'm also, using raw input, I'm going to prompt the user by passing this function a string that says type Q to quit or any other key to continue. Now this is the repetition. I'm going to say while, once again this is a Boolean expression just like with the if statement, while response is not equal to Q, the character Q, I have to have the apostrophes around it, while it's not equal to Q, and white space again is important in Python, not other languages, but in Python, tabbing over tells the program when the while loop begins and when it ends. After, when we tab back to the left hand side, it's the end of the while loop. So everything that's tabbed over will be repeated until we type in Q. So while the response is not equal to Q, keep doing this over and over again. One thing to be wary of is that when you're doing a loop of this type, when you're asking for the input and it's going to terminate the loop, you must prompt the user, you must allow the user to enter the response again. Because if you don't enter the response again within the loop, if you do it outside of the loop but not in the loop, then you have an infinite loop. It will keep going because you don't get a chance to change the value of response. And it's the value of response that will terminate or stop the loop. So while response is not equal to Q, it's going to keep going. After the loop terminates, we go back to sequence, and program control then moves down, and I print a message. And I could do other things after that. That's sequence. I keep going. I could do an if statement, do selection, then I could keep going again. So let's run this. F5. Oops, need to save, and I run it. So here's our code. You can see the source code over here, and this is the code running. So type Q to quit, any other key to continue. So I'm going to press enter, and it says hello. I'm going to press enter again, it says hello, and I keep pressing enter, and then finally I get tired of this game and I press Q and it says bye now. That's a very simple example of repetition, or also known as iteration. And while response is not equal to Q, I keep doing this. Now why would I want to do that? There are many cases which we'll look at later why you'd want to do this. It's a core construct in programming. But one of the most common ones is I might give a choice of menus. So I'll choose A, B, or C. I'll type in A, then I'll do a number of things, then it'll bring me back to the menu, and then I can type in B, and I can keep coming back to the menu until I want to quit the program. So that's quite a common use of a while loop, but there are all sorts of other uses of it. Now there are other loops, such as, depending on the languages, there's do, while, there's repeat until. There are different implementations of the loops. We have entry conditions and exit conditions where we check the condition, this Boolean equation for true or false. But let's not think about that now. Let's look at the while loop, and we're going to look at one more loop now called the for loop. This one I'm looking for this Boolean expression to be evaluated to true. So while the response is not equal to Q, that's a statement or a Boolean expression, and when it evaluates to true, it's going to terminate. And now I'm going to look at a different kind of loop. And here's my other loop. Delete and paste it. So this is a for loop. So this time I'm going to do it a set number of times. And I've got a range. There are different ways of writing a for loop. And here I've got a range from 0 to 3. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to print. If you notice here, I don't always have to add the brackets for print. But it's probably best to stick with one system. Otherwise it gets confusing. So I pass a string, we're on time, and I use this thing called %d. This means decimal. And then I give it % and the variable. And let's see. Is it going to work? So let's run it. And I save it, changes, and there we go. So what it's done is it says we're on time 0, 1, 2. Because this is x, and in this for loop, x runs whatever in the loop, whatever is tabbed over. Remember, once we tab back to the left, we've come out of the loop and we're going back into sequence, and wherever else we're going from there, the control flow goes back in here. But this bit's going to be repeated 3 times. And the value of x is going to start at 0, and it's going to go until it reaches 3, or while it's less than 3. So it's going to be 0, 1, and 2. In programming, we don't like to waste numbers, so instead of starting counting at 1, we start counting from 0, because particularly in the early days, memory was scarce. So we count 0, 1, 2. It gets a little bit confusing, but you will get used to it. So 0, 1, 2, and that's a for loop, and we've just gone around a set number of times. By now you're probably confused, and that's because you haven't practiced yet. But believe it or not, we've covered the majority of the knowledge that you need to know, of the information that you need to know. And now we can build up algorithms, typical algorithms you get on exam papers, and develop and practice. We can run these algorithms. We can do something called trace tables, which I'll go over later with them. And we can do flowcharts to represent it. We can write pseudocode, which is like code, but a little easier. And we can do a number of different exercises around algorithms, and then we'll really build up our understanding of writing algorithms, sets of instructions. That's what an algorithm is. Just using those simple concepts that we've learned already. So there's not actually much more to programming than we have covered, but we need to practice. So let's read this code. Remember, once we learn to write code, we can learn to read code. And the more we read code, the easier it becomes, and then we start getting better at writing code. So what I'm doing here is I'm declaring some variables. Remember, these are places to store data temporarily while the program runs, and I give them names, and I assign values to them. So first off, I'm going to initialize them. That means to give them a starting value. So here I have something called t, and I'm going to assign the value of 0. I have something called a, I'm going to assign the value of 0. Something called c, I'll assign the value of 0. And something called n, and I will assign the value 0. I have another one called response, and I will assign the value of an empty string, double quotes. So these are all going to be numbers, and this is going to be a string, which is an array or a list of characters, several characters. Think of it as a sentence. Now, sequence and assignment. Now I'm going to go into my iteration. I'm going to say while response is not equal to Q, basically while I don't want to quit, I'm going to prompt the user to enter a number. Whatever the user types in, I'm going to assign to the value to the variable n. So I'm going to put it in the box labeled n, whatever they type in, and it's going to be a number. So that number will go into n. Now this initially might be complicated, but you get this eventually. T, another variable, which is currently 0, is going to equal t plus n. So if the person types in 2, then 2 goes into n, and then t, which is currently 0, will equal 0 plus 2. And we'll assign that to t, so t will then equal 2. C, which currently equals 0, is going to be assigned the value of c plus 1. So c starts out at 0 and then it becomes 1. So every time I go through this loop, c, which is going to stand for counter, or a count, will be incremented by 1. So it's going to count the number of times we go through this. T is going to be total. So whatever numbers I type in, it's going to gather them and keep adding them on. So if I type in 2 and then I type in 3, it's going to add 2 to 0, then it's going to add 2 to the 3, and it's going to be 5, and then if I type in 5, it's going to add 5 to the 5 that's already in T, and it'll be 10. So it's just going to total the numbers. And within the loop, I prompt the user to type in whether they want to quit or continue using the input function. And that value goes into response, because response changes. And at some point response is going to be Q, and we're going to quit. Once I'm done with it, I tab over to the left because I'm done with my loop, and I have A, which is going to be average, and it's going to be assigned the value of T total divided by C, the number of the count. So it's going to give me the average. And then I'm going to go into sequence 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to print using %D for decimals, and I'm going to print the value of total, count, and average. So let's see if this works. Run. F5. Oop, I didn't save it, and here we go. Enter a number. So already the program has started at the beginning, and it's created these variables, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables, assigned these initial values to them, and we're in the loop. Now we're at this line here, and we're going to respond by typing in a number, and we'll type in 2. We don't want to quit, so we'll press another key to continue. We'll type in a number, we'll type in 3, and 2 plus 3 equals 5, so let's type in one more number. We'll type in another 5, so it should give us 10. This time we'll type in Q to quit, and the total is 10. The count is 3 because we went around the loop 3 times, and the average is 3. So once again, let me emphasize that you find this difficult to understand straight away, but once you practice this and you go through this as a flowchart, something called a trace table, pseudocode, and you do a number of these exercises, maybe just spend a couple hours practicing, it will begin to become clear, because programming is largely the same thing. Right now you're learning, if it's your first time, you're learning a language, and language is always difficult. Sì, va bene, tutto bene. La trena para Roma di partenza, binario 2. So if we don't know the language, we don't understand it. But a child that speaks that language, a 3-year-old, can understand it. So it's not complicated, but it takes time. So I'll go over more of these later. Thank you.